Well, welcome back to the study. Hope we aren't here for too long. But we're going to continue in our studies in Genesis, where we've gone back to the beginning to see how that has shaped us and how we've arrived at where we are now. And so far we've just looked at 8 words really, but these 8 words have shown us our amazing God. In the beginning, God. It showed us that we have a God who was there at the start, who gives us our beginning. And in the words, let there be light, we saw that he is an all-powerful God who has all authority. And this should lead us to worship alone. Well, you might be glad to know we're going to pick up the pace a little and do a few more than 4 words today. We're going to look all the way up to verse 25 of chapter 1, what was read to us. And this morning we're going to think about creation. Creation is amazing and should be a wonderful topic that we all can talk about. We all experience it all the time. We just have to walk outside of our doors and we witness creation. We are fortunate to live in a beautiful part of our country where we're surrounded by green and wildlife. But we can also jump in our cars and see other bits of creation. We can take a trip out to the beach and see the sea. You can drive a bit further and find a mountain and climb it. If you're lucky, you can fly to other parts of the world and witness other bits of creation, wonders of the world. But even if you can't do that, you could turn on your TV and watch one of these wonderful documentaries they make now. Cameras that have gone deep undersea to see amazing sea life. Film crews that have headed deep into the rainforest to witness wonderful wildlife. And we've already seen in scripture, like in the book of Psalms, often their starting point in praising God is praising him because he is the wonderful creator and praising him for his creation. And whilst it can be wonderful to talk about it, sometimes something as Christians we don't always want to, because there is an elephant in the room around this topic. And before we want to do anything else this morning, I want to talk about that elephant in the room. And it's this, that the creation account that we have read about this morning is not widely accepted in our society as true. And it's not the origin of our earth that you would be taught in school. And maybe that's a problem for you. On the other hand, you might be used to the world not agreeing with you. That's not the problem. But what confuses you is the fact that there is major differences among Christians and their understanding on this too. We started to see this a little bit when we looked at the gap theory in verse 2 last week. But actually Christians hold many different views on creation here too. Many do believe in a literal 6-day creation and hold a young earth view. But there are others who hold a day time period view that believe that the days of creation are not 24-hour days as we understand them now, but they are just designated time periods that could have been days or months representing each period of creation. Others hold to what is called a framework hypothesis that says Genesis 1 doesn't present us with a chronological account at all, but more of a poetic piece that is a representation on the themes and theologies that we should be pulling out of Genesis 1. Now, I keep my hands pretty close to my chest on most things, but I think I have to let you know on this one that I would be one of those who is described as holding a young earth view. I believe in a 6-day creation. Those who know me well, though, would know that I get much more excited talking about origins at a theological or a philosophical level rather than a scientific one. That's just the way I tick. But that doesn't mean I've arrived at that understanding blindly. Whilst I tick that way, I'm grateful to God for others who tick it other ways, particularly in this scientific way. Those with scientific minds who've looked into this and come to similar conclusions and teach on this. And whilst I can't teach on that this morning, and it wouldn't be right for me, I'd be very happy to point you in the direction of those people who've come to this conclusion scientifically. But as one who holds these views, I want to say on one hand, it's fine for Christians to disagree on these things. If you've studied fully and have prayed and come to these decisions before God, then that's good. It's also something I'm not going to fall out with anyone over, and it's not something that would stop us working with someone else over. But on the other hand, if you are still working through these things or constantly revisiting them, then I would say that maybe what you believe might not be as important as how you got there. And what I'm saying is that I believe that there are a couple of reasons for discarding a literal six-day creation that should be avoided. And the first is this: those who say, because science says. Now, this isn't science bashing. Science is wonderful. But we can sometimes fall into the trap that the world falls into, which says science says. And in doing so, we make science a person. More than that, we make science an infallible person, one who can do no wrong. In many ways, it feels like people have tried to do away with and explain away the God of the Bible, but have replaced it with another God in science. Science, in that way, doesn't exist. Science isn't a person. So what are people saying? What are they really meaning when they say science says? Well, firstly, I think what they're saying is scientists say. People who study science. But what we've seen is science as a topic is like any other topic. Scientists, like any others, historians, theologians, philosophers, have a wide range of opinions. So it's impossible to say a statement that every scientist agrees on. I've mentioned that there are some scientists who hold a literal six-day creation. But even among others, there are those who would hold an evolutionary view. But even among them, there would be a wide range of differences of opinion within that understanding. Also, scientists still remain human. And to be human is to have bias. Again, that's not just scientists, but historians and philosophers too, Christians and non-Christians alike. We all come with a worldview, with a set of preconceived ideas in how we approach our topic, which again makes it impossible to see one voice or to make blanket statements. The second thing I think people mean when they say science says is scientific discovery. And scientific discovery is wonderful. It has helped us and it will continue to do so. But again, don't be fooled that scientific discovery is without limitations. Scientific method uses experimentation to gather data. Scientists form a hypothesis from that data by looking at patterns and relationships. And scientists can learn wonderful things from that process. But there will always be limitations. However big the source of data you gather, the exemption from the rule might still be out there. If a medicine was trialled and cured 100,000 people of an illness, then we would generally accept that that medicine was a successful cure for that illness. But in doing so, we wouldn't rule out the fact that there might be one person out there who wasn't in that test group that the medicine might not work for. Scientific discovery has limitations. And the fact is that science is limited to that data. It can tell us how things work often, but it can't go beyond that and tell us why. It can't account for feelings, motivations, and subjective opinions. Scientific method itself grows and changes constantly too. There are things that we now have evidence for that we wouldn't have believed 100 years ago, and there are things that could possibly we accept now that could be disproved in another 100 years. Like I said, this isn't science bashing. I encourage you, go study science. It's wonderful. But don't discount what you read in Genesis 1 because at some point a teacher has stood up and said, science says. Because there is no single voice. Science is not a person. Secondly, don't discard what you read in Genesis 1 because of the belief that God couldn't do it or he wouldn't do it that way. There are plenty in the world who deny the power of God, but not a lot who would voice that within the church. But sometimes, even though not voiced, it can be behind the reasons of not wanting to believe in a six-day creation. God is the God of science, but he's also the God of miracles. God created the rules this universe works to, but as its creator, he is not constrained by them. The rules say sick people can't get miraculously healed, but praise God, in him they can. The rules of life say dead people stay dead and they don't come back to life. But praise God, those rules didn't get in the way of Jesus Christ. The rules say you cannot create this world in 6 days. But God could have. God could have created this world in 6 nanoseconds if he wanted, because he is God. And let's not second guess God. Let's not say God wouldn't have done it that way. What does God teach us? He says, my thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. Let's not limit God in our reasoning. Well, I've probably spent a bit longer on that than I wanted to, but I think it's really important for us to know what we believe. But it's also equally important for us to know why we believe it. And even though we've spent a bit of time on this morning, there's loads more we could have talked about. So let's keep having those conversations. But what I want to get back to now, and what most agree with, is that Genesis 1 is not so worried about the how of creation, but the who. Genesis 1 is to show us our great and wonderful God. And so far we've picked out a few of these attributes. He's eternal, all-powerful. He has all authority. And today I want to pick out a couple more for us. Genesis 1 wants us to see our great, creative, generous God. Look at our passage, the one that was read to us again. He creates the sky, the seas, the land, and then he fills them. Verse 11, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants and fruit trees. I don't like the word sprout usually, especially around Christmas time, but here it's a wonderful word. It's a word that speaks of life and creativity, life shooting up out of the ground. We know that there's a practical side to this. The plants are for food and for living, but that's not where it stops. I don't give my wife a bunch of flowers and she says, oh, that's practical. No, because there's beauty in creation. And our God created that. He created beauty. He made colour. On this day we found out that roses can be red and violets can be blue. On these days of creation, he made flavour. Why do apples taste different to carrots? Well, because our great and generous God created it that way. Verse 20 tells us he made the sea creatures. But he didn't just make a fish or one type of fish. He made every type of fish and sea creature. He thought up the giant whales and made them. But at the same time, he made the plankton too. We're supposed to see this wonderful creative God in the variety of the things that he made. But not just in the variety, in the numbers that he made. Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creature. Swarm with swarms. It's written that way to emphasize the sheer numbers of creation and the greatness of the Creator. The sky is full of birds. Verse 24, the land is filled with creatures. And again there we see livestock, cattle and sheep. But we see the beasts, the lions, the tigers, the bears, oh my. But also the tiny creepy crawlies. They all come from God's imagination. And he filled the earth by calling them into being. Last week we said the ease of the command of light shows God's power. Well, here we see the ease and sometimes the understatedness of the Genesis account shows what a wonderful creator he is. We've seen the wonderful descriptions of plants and wildlife, but in other places the creation seems downplayed almost. Look at verse 9 and 10. God made the land. That's it. He called the dry land earth and saw that it was good. Earth. But included in that dry land is mountains. Mount Everest. The Grand Canyon is included in the land. God made all the land. Look at verse 14 again. God made the sun and the moon. Verse 16, two greater lights. The greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night. And the stars. And the stars. Just casually added on in the end of Genesis there. There are estimated 200 billion stars in the Milky Way. And estimated another 100 or so billion galaxies in the universe. I can't do the maths, but someone else did and worked out that if you had a computer that was to observe 10,000 million stars a second, it would take that computer 63 million years to count all the stars in the universe. Yet Psalm 147 tells us he determines the number of the stars. He gives to all of them their names. But it appears in the verse, and he made the stars. This is our great, creative, generous God. The second characteristic I want us to see today is God's dominion over his creation. His rule over his creation. God brings all these things into being, but he keeps them, he sustains them. They are his. He is both the cause and force of creation. Look at where we were last week, verse 5. God called the light day. In verse 10, God called the dry land earth. He called them seas. And there is power in that naming process. We get to name our children because we are their parents and they get to live with that name that we have given them. You carry a surname for that reason. In many cultures, your surname is still your father's name, son of David or David's son. When a woman marries, she can change her surname, and there's power in that. It represents coming out of her father's home and starting a new family unit. There's power in names, and here we see God calling forth these things and naming them. It shows his dominion and his rule over them. And he pronounces them as good because they're his, so they're good. He creates the great sea creatures, the great land beasts, we're told. But he creates them and he has dominion over them. This isn't a case of Frankenstein's monster, where something is made and then it eclipses its maker and the maker loses control. No. In Job 41, God is describing the Leviathan, a great beast of the sea, to Job. A great sea beast that no man can control. But not so with God. The point we're meant to see is that these are not rival powers that need to be overcome by God, but creatures that we look at and should say, wow, but creatures that are subject to their maker. God is the wonderful creator, and he rules over his creation. So what do we do with this morning? Well, like the last weeks, we add these characteristics of God to the others we've learnt. And in the same way as them, these new ones too lead us to worship. We have a great, eternal, generous creator God who rules with all authority and is alone worthy of our worship. But this also gives us reason to trust this God. And especially now in the light that of everything that has happened and everything we're going through, as we face a great unknown, who are we going to trust? Well, Genesis 1 shows us it should be him alone. In the past, people called out to the sun as a god. They believed it controlled human affairs. How futile that was! They didn't need to call out to the sun, they needed to call out to the one who made it and named it, and who controls it. Of course, we're a civilized people now. People don't believe in sun gods, or do they? What are people calling out to at the moment? Nature? Crystals? Angels? The universe? Told to call out to the universe for power. Call out to the universe. That's nonsense. The universe has no power of its own. It was made by an almighty creator, and it is maintained and ruled by that all-powerful God. And it's to that God alone we need to come. It's to that God alone we need to cling. In him alone can we trust at this time and always. Lead me to the rock which is higher than I. In the shadow of his wing I take refuge. I trust in the unchangeable, the great I am.